On the VIDA statistics on gender and racial / ethnic representation in book reviewing. We have an august panel here today. And I'll start introductions coming across this way. On my far left, Parul Sehgal. Parul is an editor at the New York Times Book Review. She is the recipient of the Blakean Citation for Excellence in Reviewing from NBCC. And her work appears in the New York Times, Slate, Book Forum, Tin House, and the Literary Review, among other publications. She has been a speaker at TED and is currently teaching at Columbia University while holding down a gig at the Times. You don't sleep. Next to Parul is Hawa Allen. Hawa writes fiction and criticism. Her essays have appeared in Best African American Essays and Tricycle Magazine, where she's a contributing editor. She's published fiction in Transition, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Amazon's Literary Magazine Day One, and the Chicago Tribune's Literary Supplement Printers Row Journal. A graduate of the University of Chicago, Columbia Law School, Hawa practices law and has been a fellow at Columbia's Center for the Study of Law and Culture. So if this gets to become a fracas, we have legal representation. Next to Hawa is Alexander Chi. Alexander is the author of the novels Edinburgh and The Queen of the Night, forthcoming from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt in February 2016. He's a recipient of several awards and fellowships, including the Whiting and NEA Fellowship, and fellowships from McDowell, the VCCA. His essays and stories have appeared in the Times Book Review, Tin House, Slate, Guernica, NPR, and Out, among others. He's taught writing at Wesleyan, the Iowa Writers Workshop, Columbia, Sarah Lawrence, and UT Austin. He's the curator of Dear Reader at Ace Hotel and a contributing editor at Literary Hub. He lives in New York. And you have an event tonight, right?
Yes, thank you.
Right.
7 p.m. at Ace Hotel, New York, for Dear Reader.
Awesome. Next to Alex is Miriam Markowitz, Deputy Literary Editor of The Nation, and NBCC board member. She's previously been an editor at Harper's and Vietnam News in Hanoi. Her essay, Here Comes Everyone, examines our topic for the day. It's a great piece. If you haven't read it, it was in The Nation in 2013, right? November 2013. Really strong piece. We'll be talking a little bit about that piece here momentarily. We have a guest who's trying to hide behind me a little bit. Kate Marvin, who is a really fantastic poet, recently published a collection, Oracle. She's here as a VIDA representative, and we are really thankful you're here to join our conversation. It goes without saying, I think, that this is a thorny, slightly controversial issue, but also, I think, a really interesting one, especially one to have in public, so as to speak about the ways in which we think through race and ethnicity and gender, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes not at all, and whether or not this has some deep effect in how our culture functions, especially our literary culture. So as a way of kind of initiating conversation in the most incendiary fashion I can think of, I wonder if any of this actually matters outside of the community we inhabit, which is to ask whether criticism generally, book criticism specifically, is simply an insular game, Or are the problems we see arising from magazines and journals and the lack of representation around women, especially women of color, as we can see from the numbers, is significant to how we are living in the culture generally? Whoever would like to begin.
I think that it's a funny sort of belief that I see a lot of. I don't know where it comes from. You know, I suppose the question at bottom is, do book reviews matter, and then does it matter whether or not they're diverse? And I think I've seen criticism take a lot of beating in my own time on this planet. It's gone from being a kind of august institution to something that no one thought they had to pay for, and that maybe anybody could do. And you know, somewhere in the middle of all that, I think there is a tremendous excitement about literary culture in the United States. And I think what we saw happen with the decline of book criticism sections in, you know, across the United States in, say, the 90s and then the aughts, is, you know, the rise of book blogging showed that actually it did matter. It mattered so much that actually when you took it away, everyone jumped in. So I think it matters enormously, and I think believing that you don't matter is, in some ways, one of the biggest problems. And believing that, you know, diversity on its own is a term that I'm uncomfortable with, because I think it expresses the problem in some sort of hygienic way.
Yeah.
You know, like what's needed is something that looks like a Benetton ad, but made out of books. And actually, what you're fighting for is something that looks like your life.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I think I can answer your question just anecdotally and personally. Like, I grew up only person of color in my class in a very white school in a very white neighborhood, and outside of DC, I grew up reading the now defunct Washington Post Book World, RIP, every week, and that was my world of ideas. That was absolutely where I started to think about what it meant to be an adult, what it meant to be somebody who could be bristly and have combative ideas, and what one idea looked rubbing off of another. And every Saturday and Sunday, that's what I did. And criticism was my favorite art form, whether it's long and intense or short and quippy. Like, it's just something I loved. And you know, I think that when you have book review sections or book review blogs, and the people whose books are being treated seriously all look the same, you know, you're sending a very clear message about who belongs in this world. I mean, Karen Long, I think, is here, and she's got a great way of speaking about diversity, and she's just like, it's who can speak, right? And so when you're reading that, and I remember looking at those book sections week after week and being like, who can speak? And luckily I was coming up in that time when the great boomlet of, you know, Indian American fiction was happening, and the Jubilee Lahiris were happening, and Arundhati Roy, this poor girl from a lower caste family in India, was happening. And that was the time where I started to feel absolutely, by virtue of these women, that there was permission, that there was space. You know, and then I remember hearing the name Sunny Mehta, and I was like, oh, Indians are here, you know? And all of these things, only much later did I realize they made this world look hospitable. They made this world look like it was for me.
I guess my answer to that is yes and no. Yes, for some of the reasons that were already discussed. as well as, yes, with respect to these sort of prestige publications that need to recognize that the readership that they imagine is not the actual readership that exists. And without expressing an interest in engaging that readership, you know, it's a matter of evolution. They're either going to have to adapt or they're going to die, period. So, you know, it should matter for that reason as well. And the reason why it doesn't matter is that if someone likes to read, they're going to find something to read that appeals to them, that engages them, and they're not necessarily going to have to rely now on these publications that populate the VIDA list in order to get the sort of books and the materials that reflect their lives. You know, with the explosion of blogs, the internet, all the modes of self-expression that now people are engaging with, they don't need a few, you know, sort of blue chip publications to tell them what's available to read or what they should be reading. So if those publications want to be relevant, particularly in a time in America where most of the people are going to be people of color, you know, at a time when women are more represented on all fields of educational systems, they're going to be rising through various industries, they're going to have to expand and cater to that, or at the very least, acknowledge that that readership exists. You know, one thing that was interesting, and I don't know how much it's been discussed, but the Pew Research Center put out a study on who's reading books, and they saw that not only are women most likely to read books, but it's Black college-educated women. Those are the ones who are most likely to read books of all of those demographics. And, you know, I don't know, maybe I'm a Black woman, I see a Black woman over there. Hi. So, you know, the people who are, you know, actually reading are not the people who are in these rooms having these conversations, and they're not the people making these decisions, and they're going to find something else to read. So.
Yeah. It's long been puzzling to me who actually is the readership of these magazines, and I was often, just as a writer, I write poetry, I would sometimes not be very interested in some of the publications, and I thought I would be naturally the person who would be a target audience as like an academic and stuff like that. And then I came to sort of ascertain that in fact my desires were not being catered to in terms of what I wanted to read, and there was a reason why I wasn't really connecting to a lot of the pieces. Like I say that, you know, as someone who reads as a writer, but I think that one of the reasons why, I mean, I have so many things to say about why it does matter as an author. It matters to me that my book goes out and finds its readers. And someone who reviews my book is going to help me in that endeavor after I've spent a lot of time creating this book. So that's incredibly important to me. Also, you know, I grew up reading the Post book review too. But there's also sort of the cruel reality about production, one's literary production, and it's really influenced with where one is published. In poetry, where you make no money, still you might, if you have a really good publication, that can be the ticket that gets you to an artist residency. That might help you get tenure, that might open a door for a job. And all of these things factor into how much time you're going to have to write. So the reason why I'm interested in the numbers is because I think that they directly impact the production of literature, and the literature that I really want to see being produced. And it's not just my literature, but, you know, all of the literature that is not sort of being brought to me through these venues where I'm being told that I'm going to get the best of the best in this venue, and it's not like I'm not totally sure of if I'm being given true access. Like I find that doubtful. So yeah.
I think it obviously matters, or we wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have written about it, I wouldn't be thinking about it all of the time. I'm a representative of one of those prestige outlets where our numbers are still, you know, pretty unfortunate. but I think that there are a lot of different questions here. Some of them are about the two different economies of publishing. One of them is material and the other is prestige. In terms of what is happening right now, I think we're seeing a bigger and bigger divide between those economies. Especially with ebook sales, stuff like that, there is a sort of a massive de-intellectualization that has happened in publishing in general. And part of that, the fact that people are cutting reviews and coverage of books, I think reflects that sort of move towards the industry as essentially a consumer venture, which is relatively new. Until big corporations took over publishing and expected a 10% return on their investment, book publishers were smaller. They essentially, they tried to make ends meet in order to publish the books that they wanted to publish. So there are a lot of really complicated questions here, obviously, but I think the question is, the main question is, do you think books matter? I do. So, that's why I'm here, that's why I do what I do. If you think books matter, then presumably you think writing about books also matters, and ideas matter. I think that one of the things, there is a consumer mentality even among the, we've gotten very, very interested in seeing the reality that we want in everything that we do nowadays. Book reviews and publishing in general reflect the inequities of the world at large. To a certain extent, the question of does this matter? One thing that I find really interesting is why, it has to do with the orientation of the founders of VIDA, but it's interesting that this conversation is located primarily right now in book reviews and criticism as opposed to magazines in general. We're not counting bylines at National Geographic, etc., when in fact the actual sort of money and power doesn't reside, for the most part, in these publications. Where that is tricky is that they are publications of influence, where we publish thought leaders, to speak in marketing jargon. And so in that sense, what we hold up as being worthy, of thought leadership, then has, it diffuses in some way into the culture at large. That said, what's the actual sort of, is there some sort of quantifiable relationship between those things? Not really. So I'm going to stop there for now because I could keep talking.
I think what's interesting is we know it matters, and we now have numbers to demonstrate where our shortfall happens to lie. However, from the insatiation of the counting to 5 years later, we still have some institutions that are, shall we say, reticent to change. So, where does that reticence come from? Especially since we know that there is some deep and real political, intellectual work that happens from seeing yourself represented in the literary culture and learning to narrate yourself through it. And I think I'll just say this on the table in my thinking. The culture is generally misogynist and it's generally racist. So wouldn't it make sense to open up cultural spaces so that we start to shift that narrative about ourselves, nationally speaking? So what's the reticence from? Why refuse to change once we know that these numbers are before us?
Well, I don't really know, because I'm not in publishing, but I mean, I think, you know, I don't think that you can just automatically, I mean, just personally speaking, you can't just suddenly like change everything, you know, and radically shift everything, because you know, with any collaborative effort, there's so many different, you know, pieces in play. I think that for me personally, like we didn't start, you know, counting to like, to make people uncomfortable, to point these things out. Basically, we wanted to start a conversation about it because we're trying to figure out what is the reticence, you know, and that's the whole thing. Is it's probably different for different people, and it's just about becoming, in a lot of ways, more comfortable with like self-assessment and looking at one's own biases, which as a teacher, doing the count has taught me a lot about my own practices. So anecdotally, you know, first of all, I think, back to your question, does it matter? Yeah, it matters a lot to like my undergrads who are City University of New York students who don't have access to things like this and would be really excited to be here, right? But I think that being able to, you know, look at your own choices, your own reading choices, and assess them. And as someone who pretty much read a lot of white male poets, you know, for like most of my life, and was teaching a lot of white male poets, a lot of them dead, I kind of had to say, okay, this may be my education. I could just say, well, that's who I was taught. But that's like, you know, that's not me taking responsibility for it. So I've had to just look at my reading and what I teach and change that up. And just look at it on a really practical level. I did it recently with the class I teach at Lesley, where I looked at the reading packet and it was predominantly white. And so I spent a few days. It wasn't hard to find some really amazing poems by people of color to put in there. It's definitely improved the class. And so it's just you know, I guess not feeling defensive about it so much, but looking at how much it's going to enrich your own experience in reading, writing, and teaching.
Before you jump in, it might not be that difficult to change. I mean, speaking anecdotally,
yeah.
After the first count, I made a choice. I said, you know, I'm only pitching reviews by women, or reviews of books by women. And for about, I'd say about a year and a half, with the exception of maybe one review, all those reviews were by women. Maybe that comes from the self-reflection, but you know, I noticed also in my reading for our conversation that Salon published, just about a year apart, essays concerning writers of color, one by Amy Fawn, the next by Celeste Ng, and both of them basically say the same thing. Asian American women writers are ignored. So in a year's time, nothing had shifted, right? And both of those pieces were pieces that were prominently placed and distributed among readers, Twitter, Facebook, so on. So I think that's where my question is coming from, that like, maybe I'm fully aware of certain kinds of psychological or business-oriented complications, but why not just source the writers, get different writers in place and choose different books? Go ahead, assigning editors.
I can answer that question, because it actually, there are structural impediments to that. When you say the word reticence, yes, there are plenty of people who are reticent, but like, you know, for the Oprah Book Club, post the year 2000, she chose, I think, possibly exclusively white male authors for, you know, however many years, a lot. We have all internalized this. Like, that is what the culture values, and that is sort of across the board. So changing that is not as simple as saying, you know, okay, I'm gonna do more of this or more of that. Publications have stables of writers that they've been using for a long time. Book review space is shrinking. The amount of people who actually pay money for book reviews and who, you know, pay money for criticism, extended criticism, those venues are, they're disappearing right now. There's increased competition even for, for space. There's increased competition even now. Very established critics have a tough time getting a lot of their stuff published. So basically, like, structurally, could I change the numbers tomorrow if I were the boss? Actually, no, because I assign about 8 months in advance on average. But the other thing is that that would involve firing a lot of people, a whole lot of people. And I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but when you think about, there's a reason why even at publications that are headed by women editors-in-chiefs, like such as The Nation, we still have these problems. And it's not just because we don't feel like changing. So again, there are people who I'm constantly surprised by the lack of awareness on many people's parts, but I actually think that in general, that the conversation has really developed and changed a lot, that awards committees are responding faster than publications are. And then the other thing is that one thing that is easier to do is to change books that are assigned rather than change, it's really hard to overhaul an entire stable of freelance writers, especially if you're, for instance, a two-person shop, as we are, and we publish, 10,000 words per week. So, like, and as I have said, this is not an excuse, but what I'm going to say, and this is, I pay a lot of attention to it, but, when I query people, when I pitch them, when I pitch Black writers, I pitch 10 for every one who queries me. Those numbers improve when I start talking about other ethnicities, and also people who are not necessarily in this country, which is an interesting factor that we haven't talked a lot about international writers. And then those numbers get better with women. But like, it's a slow process, and I'm not making excuses for it, but I think that so much of this conversation has been about the rhetoric of it, and at this point, I think that, a lot of book review editors, they're more reticent to talk about what are the actual factors to demystify the process than they are to try to change it, because they feel that they're in a defensive position. Again, I think that that's changing a little bit, and I hope it continues to.
I think one way that it's less defensive is you have to look at the mastheads, right? So for me, it's never defensive. It's like a different. It's again, each institution has different pressures that they're under. The Times Book Review in 5 years has made huge leaps and bounds when it comes to gender, right? We have more female reviewers than we have male reviewers. We have like some 47% of the books that we cover were written by women. We're getting there with gender. Are we there with race? No. Will we get there? Yes. And this is just. It's a painful and complicated process to decenter yourself, I think. That's really what has to happen. And you have to start saying, like, where is knowledge being produced, right? Is it, who has the monopoly? Who has had the monopoly? And then it becomes something very different. And I think that's why you have to look at the masthead. If the masthead won't solve everything, having a bunch of women or people of color, trickle-down feminism is not a thing. But and we can get into that, but it's just like, at least then something in the orientation, something in the water changes. I think, and I've seen this at the book review now, which, is now helmed by a woman, 2 women of color assigning editors. There's just, it helps when you're not thinking about it in terms of counting also. When you start thinking about it in terms of, what are we missing? Who would be the most amazing voice on this? And it's not going to be where you think you can find it, right? So for example, one example is a review that I really liked recently was, we assigned the new Stephen Millhauser book of short stories, right? So easily could have gone to like a very worthy, interesting white writer, but there's a brilliant Indian American writer named Tanya James, and it's like that kind of assignment where you're like, she's so good and she's working with myths all over the world, you know, and she can write about magic, and she can write about American identity, and she can see the way that he's playing with things in such an interesting, slanted way. And stuff like that. I think the other question that we can talk about, or that needs to happen, is once we get those writers, those women, and you know, women writers of color in the door, what assignments are we giving them? Are we giving them the same thing again and again? You know? Then what message are we sending to them? That you're just on the race beat, or you're on the woman beat? Like, so these are like other layers that are really interesting and important to attend to, as well as, you know, making the original, you know, reaching out to that person. Also, one more thing. So I hear this a lot about, you know, if a woman pitches you and you say no and she will never pitch you again and guys will do that. I think, again, this is where the mass type comes into play, because it's like I get pitches from Indian women and women of color all the time. So I think it's also what you represent in that space, which is just like, shit, she's there, you know? I mean, she's not so scary, she's, you know, like, or she's not so removed, you know? And I think that's another thing that, you know, creates that sort of invitation, that excitement, that feeling of permission.
So presence invites then others to feel as though they can be in those spaces.
I mean, also I'm so charming.
I was thinking of a study that we had, a marketing study that we had back when I worked at Out Magazine during the founding of the magazine, and the marketing study was, there were book figures that were really fascinating to me at the time, book buying figures, and the research we had that came back said that lesbians bought on an average 22 books a year. Straight women were the next highest at 14. Gay men came in at 10, and straight men came in at 1.
Just the one.
Yeah, and in the office we were like, who's bringing the average down? Like, do you like go into a bookstore and throw books away to like bring the average down that far? But it was a really puzzling figure, because the message I was receiving was overwhelming me that at the time that I was a huge risk as a writer for anyone considering publishing me, because I wasn't real to other people, which is essentially, I think, part of that reticence. You know, I remember having writing teachers who would say to me, well, if you publish, you'll be the first gay Korean American writer. And I remember thinking, what? And it's like being told you're going to be the first fish to walk out of the sea on legs. I was the first, horribly enough, and I'm now one of two. There's two of us. There's not even enough of us to have like a fight. That would be meaningful. It would just be spite. So I'm sort of waiting for more to exist, but in the meantime, like, I'm also very aware that, you know, there's a strange way in which this commercial venture that you're talking about, for example, Miriam mentioned, is kind of aimed at people who couldn't care less. They don't care. And what's been really interesting to watch happening with, just in popular culture with television this year, is what they're calling the Empire effect. Like, Empire blew everyone's minds in terms of the ratings it was able to provide for a new show. And the first thing ABC did was to sign up a ton of diverse shows for the next year. And the head of ABC Television, I believe, even actually addressed it openly. And suddenly people thought, oh, maybe we were watching declining numbers happening because our shows didn't speak to the reality of people's lives. That was the essence of it, you know? And so that's, this marketing survey I'm talking about, this happened 1991. That's a long time for that corporate venture to be pointed in the wrong direction. And so it's just, I would encourage the masters of the universe in these affairs to just, I guess, think about all the money they're losing.
But that's the thing, is the masters of the universe in this affair are not book reviews. They are publishers. Ultimately, that is where this, that's where this begins and ends. There's like, like one of the issues that we have is at The Nation we review a lot of history books, intellectual history, biographies, stuff that is just, it's a white male dominated field, and it has been for a long time, and unfortunately I think it's going to be one of the last genres to really change. So that has to do, there are a lot of different reasons why that is, but at the end of the day, it's like publishers don't take books serious. Like you said, publishers don't take books by certain demographics seriously. Like hence, the like pink pump effect on like every book ever written by a woman about relationships, etc. These are choices that people make. Based as far as I can tell on almost no marketing data, because I've looked for it, and there's absolutely none. It's based on essentially, the publishing model is like, oh, that was popular. Here's a new version of that. So, part of it is like they're not even really doing like actual research to figure out what it is people are interested in. But if the books that come into my office are, pink pumps and then serious histories, and there's a huge gender and race divide on those, and at The Nation we don't review books with pink pumps on the cover. We just don't. Then it makes things it's complicated. It's my point.
It's super complicated because when we talk about publishing, we talk about a they, right? So according to Publishers Weekly's last salary survey, publishing, we know now it's 89% white, but it's 74% women. Right? And that's not just publicists, that's management. That's like they beat men in every single category. So this is the they that we have to...
I think except for at the executive levels. Editor, that's...
No, it's still 51% women.
Really?
Maybe not, don't quote me.
Don't quote me.
Management taken as a whole is still 51% women.
My impression was that like at a certain salary level...
We just drop off.
Exactly.
No,
women just drop off
paid
entirely.
as much, but according to this, as one large category, they just looked at management, and it is 51. Men are overrepresented in management for sure, but it's still, so it's
I mean, I guess I would say, to your point about reticence, I think your point about decentering is the main issue, right? You can't see what's in their blind spot. That's why they're blind spots. And if anything, whoever is imagined to be at the margins and whoever, is not the imagined market, those are the people who are going to be able to spot every kink, every flaw. They're the best critics, right? I just watched that James Baldwin clip where they ask him, you grew up poor and black and gay and you're a writer. How was that? Like, how did you, how challenging has this been for you? And he said, well, actually, I hit the jackpot, right? That's what informs his viewpoint, and that's what allowed him to be such a prophetic voice, because he could see what the so-called people in the center, masters of the universe, whoever these people are really, honestly, could not see about themselves, and that made him such a resonant voice. And that goes back to your point about what are you assigning people of color, what are you assigning women? Are you just giving women books like about work-life balance and people of color? You're just having them sort of authenticate a piece of literature that you think is an anthropological artifact as opposed to a piece of work, a piece of art. What are you doing? So you can't, it's like with discrimination, right? The legal standard for discrimination, the disparate impact standard, you're looking at unintentional discrimination. If you don't know you're doing it, you can't fix it. And nobody wants to be that person who's stopping women and people of color from publishing. They don't want to see themselves as that person. So why would they then, take the next step and really examine and do that self-reflection and see, well, what am I not seeing? Is there someone who can show me a way of orienting my perception differently? And that's difficult for anybody, but in particular for someone who is, a decision maker, or someone who has been making these editorial decisions for years and has, gotten a lot of positive feedback and validation for it. Nobody wants to be the problem.
Which reminds me of your really great essay from the beginning of the year about the president's rhetorical responses to Ferguson versus his responses to the humanitarian event in Syria, right? And the way that he can make a human rights argument for one place but not for the other. And it is about a certain kind of vision and belief system. So it seems that there's some conflict, right? If criticism ought to do that kind of work, then shouldn't we be making spaces to actually do that with our more interior book culture, right? I mean, I suppose we're sort of doing that, but the process of thinking through not simply the numbers, but the voices, experiences, ideas crucial to creating and maintaining a culture seem to be not only marginalized or silenced, but like not imagined. So how do we foster that kind of conversation? Because that seems to be how we start turning toward maybe resolution.
I think it's curiosity is a really important part of that, and I think also pressure is helpful. When I talked earlier about changing the reading, I realized that it was really imperative I do that after I attended a presentation on the lack of diversity and how to deal with these things in the workplace. I was like, oh, I need to do this. Then my boss, I told him that I needed to change the reading, and he was like, you are just a wonderful person. And I was like, no. If I were, I would have figured this out a long time ago, but it took me a while to come around, and actually, I'm not feeling particularly proud of myself for not recognizing it earlier on my own. It took outside pressure for me to see this, because you speak of blind spots. I couldn't see it. And I was slow to coming around, and part of when we started the Women of Color count, we were very concerned with, well, how does this function? How do we do this on a practical level? Nobody's paid. We were literally like, is the rest of my life going to be taken over with this? So we had to, and then it just became more and more obvious as we started to work on how important it was, and how important it was to move that conversation from just being about gender and being like very simplistic, right? And sort of move it into another realm, eventually have people sort of doing their own counts and creating these own conversations and being comfortable with doing it. I mean, maybe a little uncomfortable, but at least not to the point that people are scared, So and I think that also you will your first attempt to do something is probably not going to be successful. With our Women of Color count this past year, it was not successful. We had a ton of pitfalls that we weren't anticipating. For example, on a practical level, most of us are professors. We're not people we're not sociologists and stuff like that. We're not trained in this. We've kind of learned how to run a nonprofit because we've had to. But when we started the Women of Color count, we sent out a survey to all of the writers who were represented by those 15 journals, hoping that they would answer and self-identify, because we were not comfortable with identifying these people. We felt it was important people self-identify. So we created the survey, and then tons of people just didn't respond. So we ended up in this crunch mode where we had to track down all these email addresses and contact these people and really try and get people to respond. And then this major oversight became glaringly obvious, that white women didn't think they needed to respond to the survey. And I was one of those women. I got surveyed. I was like, oh. And then I was like, well, how do we rephrase the language so we know that this is about everyone responding, this is everyone representing? And then it became more and more obvious in conversation, because all of these things happen in conversation. It's like you can't do this without listening to a lot of the people, being open to readjusting your perception completely. So we realized, whoa, we have this survey. We can get people to, if they wish, and hopefully they will want to contribute, identify in a number of ways. We can find out which writers are transgender. We can find out if there are people who have disabilities, or identify that way, how they want to identify. And so we kind of, this year, our aim is going to sort of have everyone like help VIDA with a count and respond to these surveys. And so we can just have a much better picture of what's going on. And the conversation can be as complicated as it already is, or it should be more complicated, yeah.
Might be a good place to pause and open the floor for anyone who'd like to jump in with questions.
Well, I have a sort of question and a comment. I review almost entirely nonfiction, and I would say, as a reviewer of nonfiction, it's always a challenge to find books to review that are going to be representative of the whole culture, because it is such a white male field. And I think that there are sort of structural publishing problems that reviewers kind of have to play catch up with, and we have to cast a wider net. And I wondered about the numbers that you brought up, Paul, because my impression, and I think I'm going to see it tomorrow on the floor of the Javits, is that there are a lot of parts of the publishing industry that are woman-dominated, but then you go to certain houses, the houses that put out the big, important, nonfiction books every year, where all the editors are white guys, or most. And these are some houses I love. But it becomes a self-reinforcing blind spot. And I just wonder, as review editors, do you think that assigning that kind of book to reviewers of color helps? Do you think that just being more conscious of casting a wider net? I mean, how do you sort of, I think fiction is a totally different issue, by the way, because I think fiction is much more diverse these days, and I think nonfiction is still just like,
It's incredible.
it's incredible.
And
And it's not just white men, it's white men, college professors, 50 plus.
And here you mentioned history. I do some history. I do a lot of science. I do math.
Yeah.
And I've seen one book by a woman writer in the field of math in 3 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, one of the things I like to do is very aggressively hunt out young women writers on science and math. Just get them into the book, get their voices out there, get them part of the conversation. Just because it's interesting, it's important, you do what you can. And to your point, I have facts. So
Let's hear your facts.
I came with facts. So Ruth Franklin, they're out there, they're old facts, but Ruth Franklin in 2010, went back and she was like, let me look at what are the books actually coming out? What are we trying to correct against? And most of the publishing houses that she looked at, only 25 to 30% of the books they published were by women. And this is Norton, this is Knopf, this is FSG. These are the publishing houses that you're talking about, right? So it's, so I mean, I'm doing exactly what you're saying, which is just trying to sort of create those networks, create this sort of content.
But these little things really matter. They matter to individual people, So I noticed, I just sort of took over the account from Jennifer Fitzgerald. I've been restructuring it. And one thing I noticed is that our intern pool, they were very accomplished interns. And I had all these great students, undergrads at the College of Staten Island. I'm just like, why am I not pulling these guys? They're so into literature. So I've started to, I realized that they need access.
And they need money. But if you're trying to get working class interns, that's right.
We don't pay anything.
Yeah. I'm just saying.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because it's just like if you're a person who can grant access, then you can change a lot. Just even if it is for just a few people who know then to make those changes in their daily life. But then it is sort of a mystery, like where who are the masters of the universe? And today I went and I had lunch with my former teacher, Ed Hirsch, who's president of the Guggenheim Foundation, and I went into the lobby, and it was just all men in suits, and I was like, oh, and it was all secure, like you get your pass, or like they don't want just anybody going in there, and I just was like, I don't like it here, but that was sort of eye-opening today.
Well, I kind of forgot what the question was because I was thinking things.
Well, let me ask, what are your ideas for expanding your
Okay.
roster?
Well, one thing I would say is that, I have a couple of, I was recently sort of chastised for assigning a book by a woman to a white man. And the theory was like, well, why wouldn't you want a woman to review this important book? And the answer was that, well, this guy asked me, and he's very qualified to write about it, and he's really interested in it. But I think that, there's a lot of self-segregation that happens. There's a lot of discouragement among, women are less likely to pitch me or to take on ambitious assignments, like big ideas assignments. They feel less qualified to write about things that are outside of their sort of immediate purview. It takes, work to groom writers into people who are able to do that and who feel confident doing that. But I think that like one of the things that is actually really important is in terms of seeing yourself in the pages, like I think it's important to have white dudes reviewing things by people who are not like them. And it's that kind of orientation change, like to a certain extent, like they are still the masters of the universe, although frankly, I don't really understand what this term means. I don't really think that I don't think it really applies in many ways to what we're talking about. There are real masters of the universe. They work in finance. They mostly don't work in book publishing. But the point of it is that, like, to a certain extent, I think that if what we want is to see new types of people in our pages, one of the things we really have to do is encourage people to think, to write about people who are not like them. And if that means that like there's a white guy writing about a woman of color, I think that that's actually kind of a victory in many ways, because getting a white guy to pay attention to a woman of color is often not that easy.
I don't know. This is complicated, right? For the longest time, the only people writing about women of color were white men, right? And narrating histories and writing the novels about it. I mean, it's a bit complicated. I don't know if I would qualify it as a victory. What I do think is interesting and important is making sure that women aren't just reviewing women, people of color aren't reviewing, but sometimes it's very useful and it's very important. I'm thinking about this. There's the recent book by Paul Beatty, The Sellout, and it's reviewed by a lot of people, white people. But then, and I'm sorry, but this is an assignment I was particularly proud of and I really loved. Kevin Young reviewed, I know, okay, so, yeah. So Kevin Young reviewed it for us, and what he did was, like, so everybody was reading this book and they're like, oh, it's new, this hasn't been done. Kevin Young was like, let me take you down to a little history of black satire and why this book, where it succeeds, where it fails. He situated it, he gave it context. Rachel Kadzigansa is a writer I really love. And one thing that she does is, she profiles almost exclusively black artists. And the way that she says, like her sort of rationality, she's like, these are lives that need context, they need space, they need, long word counts, they need somebody who's going to think about the headline, somebody's going to think about the captions. And that kind of love and that kind of sort of editorial vision is sorely needed. So, I mean, I agree, the diversity and stuff, but we also need people that can give that kind of context.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that. I mean, that's something actually I've been thinking about in terms of not only my personal reading or my reviewing, but my scholarship as well. That white people have been talking about the other forever and always. And that the problem of imagination is actually a central problem still, how the other is imagined or not imagined very well or humanized. So I will quibble with that particular notion, because not to say that they should be cut off, but I think context matters. And I recall a piece that Wanda Coleman wrote years and years and years ago in The Nation about black book reviewing, because she had been taken to task for what she had to say about a Maya Angelou book. And that's a great piece about what it takes to actually look at a work by a writer of color and be able to do not only the aesthetic work of critiquing, but also the cultural, intellectual, historical work. And it kind of takes training. And it's not simply about getting the book and saying, okay, well, I don't know anything about this. You know, in my memory, there's a great review of the first book by, oh gosh, I can't remember the name of the writer, but I remember it was a Ward Just review. And maybe in the lead, he said, I didn't know black people had money.
Oh yeah, it was the guy who was a law professor, Stephen Carter.
Yes, yeah, Stephen Carter.
Yeah, he was
right?
shocked.
He was shocked.
There's a black upper class I never knew.
Right? I mean, and this is a person who's delivered to us as a sophisticate. So, you know, it's worrisome, frankly.
Yeah, but Walton, I'm obviously not talking about sort of like naive I'm talking about training people to be able to do sensitive cultural work about things that are not about them. Like, I mean, yes, of course that's what it has historically been like. But, you know, I have another piece that is in the works about the issues that Palestinian women face in the legal system in Israel. Again, it's a white Jewish guy who's writing this piece for me. And on one hand, I could say, you know, and it's complicated because even in the nation, somehow we have not addressed this topic yet. And, you know, the question was sort of, well, do you run the piece? Or, you know, do I not run the piece and then have this issue still not appear in the nation? And, you know, the work that he did it's sensitive, it's research-based, it's enabling, you know, it has the voices of these women in it. So I understand, of course, I understand and I take your point, but I also think that, like, at a certain, we also have to get to a place where we feel comfortable making some mistakes in order to advance things in a more holistic way.
What I'm about to say is not in any way helpful. But I think, you know, it takes time to do all this stuff, right? It takes time to, you know, I mean, to like even, you know, if you have access to an education, it takes time to conduct that education. And to me, the problem really seems to be like at the root, like the lack of support that families have from government and childcare. I'm a single mom, and I can tell you that all my money goes to childcare, so that I can. And so all of that time that you know that women or that all of these authors are going to have to create these books, to read all this stuff, and to be informed, and to not be afraid that they're going to be under that lens of like, oh, you're writing about relationships and you're a woman, so it's just this, even though this guy's doing it and it's something else. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's harmful to women. I think it's harmful to everyone that that you know that we don't have day-to-day practical support in terms of creating families. Because there's nothing wrong with wanting a family, right? But it becomes this thing when you're a critic or you're an artist, it's an either-or situation. You know, are you going to give up all of your time to write? I mean, I've lost at least one book because I had a kid, you know, and I'm like, it's worth it. But, you know, in some ways it's also like, you know, it angers me.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, sorry. I was going to ask you, Walton and Kate, I'm interested in, you mentioned the way that this issue overlaps, especially in nonfiction, but it's also kind of my primary sort of reviewing area. I'm very interested in the way this overlaps with problems in academia. And that this is a lot of the authority that has traditionally accrued to the people who are writing kind of the big respected books and the big respected houses comes out of an academic position of security that is vanishing faster than we can, you know, track it. It's because it's not just these men are old and white. They have tenure at these institutions, and they have time, and that is also something that is vanishing. Time, as academic labor becomes contingent, and as literary labor becomes equally contingent, you know, everyone's a freelancer in some way, in both of those fields. And so the way that you construct kind of authority is not the institution that you're allied with so much anymore as, and then we have a really interesting question about like where do you find your authority? Like as a writer, as an academic, as a critic, establish authority. And authority is not the same thing as money, but it's connected. But those things, I mean, it seems to me those things are connected, I guess. I threatened to make a comment about it.
I mean, that's such a huge question because, you know, now you have students who are, you know, fascinated by literature and they want to teach, they want to write, they want to do all these things, and to encourage them to do so is unkind, you know, because you might put someone in a situation where they will owe a lot for student loans. And the idea that, like, you know, I have a job that will never be a possibility for this person, it feels, it's just really messed up. My job is completely, you know, it's like, once it's gone forever in academia. I don't know, you know, I don't think it's helpful to be pessimistic, but things will definitely change. I mean, this is maybe a cop-out, but I mean, how can we necessarily, I think we're starting to see what you were talking about earlier, that things are, you know, it's not that we're losing all this stuff, is that it's taking a different shape, and it's basically, I think it's much more democratic now in terms of the way everything's just going to the internet, everything's going digital, and a lot of these publications are going to become obsolete.